Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Siska. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project. Welcome to our Facebook Live interview series. Today, I am with Professor Andrew Papachristos, professor in sociology at Northwestern University, and is also the director of the Northwestern Neighborhood and Network Initiative. Professor, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tracy.
So your research is in network analysis. Can you give our audience a brief little summation of what that actually means?
Yeah, so network science is the study of people's social relationships, and how they essentially impact what you feel, think, and do. And so I think most of us recognize that the people we know, the people we're related with, the people we work with, our neighbors, our classmates, our coworkers, our families, they all impact us, and they impact our behavior in very profound ways. And over the last several decades, but even dating back to the 1950s, there's been the study of the development of understanding these relationships, measuring them, and the science has shown us that it impacts, who we vote for, who we marry, the types of jobs we get, whether or not we're going to get a promotion. It also helps us impact, especially lots of people are understanding this in the context of COVID, whether or not you're at risk for getting particular diseases. And it also has been one of the key ideas within criminological research because delinquency and crime, by and large, is a group phenomenon, which means your peers can impact the sorts of trouble you get into.
Okay, so you're the director, as I said, of the Northwestern Neighborhood and Network Initiative. Can you describe
N3,
what the
N3 for short?
N3? Yeah, let's do N3.
Yeah.
I like that. Can you describe what the initiative is and what we should be expecting as far as research coming from it?
Yeah, so N3 is a new, I started it when we came to Northwestern in 2018, and we're now a staff of about 8 and have about 20 or so students. Really at the core of our efforts are an engaged research process where we partner with different institutions, organizations, nonprofits to really understand some of the problems that are facing Chicagoland. Although it's not just Chicago, we're working with some other cities. And what we try to do is we try to bring this engaged approach to science, which is, from the questions we ask to how we answer them to these particular problems. And of course, the center of this, and it's in the name, is we really strive to understand networks and how that impacts behavior, and also neighborhoods, sort of one of our fundamental units for sort of being in cities. We have a whole bunch of projects that are out there right now. We have 3 big core projects that operate the center of our work. One is the evaluation of several street outreach efforts in the city of Chicago, most notably Communities Partnering for Peace, CP4P, and Chicago CRED. We are also partnered with the Invisible Institute and applying sort of this network science to understanding police misconduct and police violence. And then third, we're just sort of finishing up an evaluation of a pilot study of a new neighborhood policing initiative in Chicago and one of the Chicago's police districts. So those are the 3 bits of sort of work that kind of occupy most of our time. And then, lots of other kind of projects come off of that.
Okay, so when I looked into this a little bit and I hearing you describe it even more, it reminds me what Chicago's had to deal with, a program from the Chicago Police Department called the Strategic Subjects List. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, that came out of some kind of network analysis background. I'm sure you're going to tell us more about it, but from what you know about it, how is that different from what you all do?
Well, the Strategic Subjects List, SSL, was developed from a team from IIT, and they finally made their sort of equations and approach public maybe about 20 months ago. So we didn't know a lot about actually what was behind it for a long time. What it tried to do, what the SSL tried to do, was identify using police data people who were at risk of victimization or gunshot injury or potential involvement in gunshot crime. So it created a list, right? Or at least a score. That's what we know about that. That is actually, there's 2 parts of that. One is sort of the science behind it, which is, understanding these factors that put people at risk, which we do in lots of contexts, and not just in the criminal justice context, in the healthcare context, in educational contexts, all of which have benefits and problems. And, what we're trying to do is not like develop a list of people that are, should be identified with the police, but in fact, think about how networks impact behavior, there are ideas of understanding about how can that be leveraged for prevention or intervention. And as I've written about in the Tribune and the New York Times, there's a big difference between how you apply these things, right? So applying something in the criminal justice context, if you put it in the space that people are referring to as predictive policing, you cross constitutional lines, you cross moral lines, but the same sort of approach in, say, victim services, trauma response, street outreach is quite different because you're not, say, infringing on people's liberty or livelihood. A great example of this is how we use the very same approach to studying infectious disease. And so historically, in the world of HIV or needle exchange, you do these sorts of mapping exercises or use these sort of statistical approaches to identify where you'll have the greatest impact on spreading slowing the rates of infection. And I recently wrote this op-ed in The Hill because people are thinking about contact tracing. The science behind contact tracing is much the same way. Who's at risk? How do we reach them to slow it down and save lives? And that's a different approach than, say, just generating a list and kind of working a list. And so, it's hard to say the overlap behind the science because they haven't been like compared or contrasted. But the idea of using data, in these spaces is an old one. And it's just one of multiple ways you could kind of look at that.
One of my highest ranking sources in the department had to do some of those contacts through the SSL, where they would go knock on a door, right, and try to offer some social services. Right. And what he would tell me about repeatedly is getting the door slammed in his face. Like, they knew they were coming, right? A lot of these people had already been visited, and they'd open the door and say, "Do you have a job?" And they would say, "Well, no, we don't have a job for you." And they would slam the door. And that always made me think that it bothers me that you don't hear criminologists talk about it enough. Isn't to some degree, a lot of this boiled down to poverty mediation or reduction, right? Is being one of the main causes why we're having these issues?
Yeah. So that's a great point. I have a certain opinion on this, and I actually think the particular moment we're at now in Chicago, but also in other cities, is it creates a bit of a trap in the following sense. When crime starts to go up, there's panic, as it should be, right? We want to save lives, and everybody starts to focus on the here and now. And actually, some of the approaches around, so what we're doing with network science, that's like, how do we save lives today, right? What can we do to stop person A from, say, being shot? The thing is that the conditions that person A is in is absolutely about a whole range of inequalities. Right. So even the decision or decision's a loose word, but even being involved in, say, a dispute today in a neighborhood in Chicago, that might be a new dispute, but it's conditioned on 400 years of bad policy and inequality and poverty being one of the key drivers. So the trap always happens when all we do is focus on the here and now, and we forget and don't do anything about those structural conditions. And it's always a trade-off. Budgets are always limited. But that then becomes this sort of debate between root causes or sort of the here and now. The truth is we have to do both, and especially when you're talking about something like gun violence or homicides. The average age of a homicide victim in Chicago is in the mid-20s, and it actually hasn't moved much in about 20 or 30 years, which means that the types of, say, programs you need to reach or stop a 25-year-old, let's say, from being engaged in violence, or to get them to kind of go a different way, is not the same of someone you would need as a middle schooler or an infant or an expecting mother or a family. And so you have to have a range of options. And always what happens in these moments is we zoom in on the sort of most immediate headline and focus on it. And let me just give one other example. Even as we talk about COVID, right? The reason we need to do contact tracing is to save lives, to get those numbers down, to make sure we can contain this thing so that life can go back to whatever it's going to go back to. But unless we address the massive health disparities in our neighborhoods, the next epidemic that happens is going to have the same impact. And we have to do both of those things. So access to healthcare, access to PPEs, access to other safe ways to move around your neighborhood and get food, all of those things are combined. And so we have to do both. And in the same context of say, violence, you have to do both at the same time. Otherwise, we just keep falling back, which is part of the reason that crime maps in Chicago haven't changed in 60 years. It's the same reason that even though crime rates fall, the same neighborhoods are always experiencing gun violence. And it's built that way. We built the city that way, quite literally, to kind of keep gun violence here and not here. And we have to do something about that at the same time that we're trying to save people's lives. And there are different suites of approaches that you need, for this whole range. It's not just one single thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things COVID has done is really exposed, not that people should have known this already, but just how bad we are we just do short-term thinking.
That's right.
Long-term solutions that'll pay real dividends 20 years down the road, we're just not interested in. The media is not interested in them. Politicians are stuck because the media doesn't report like that, and they have political concerns. So we just keep repeating the same mistakes. I actually have an intern on a separate project working on gathering quotes from city council members about how many cops Chicago should have. And just you see repeated quotes across the spectrum of politicians about how we always need more cops, right? And it's like, it's scary a little bit. Okay, next question, and I'm not sure if you have an answer to this, but it's always bugged me. Do we have a really good data-driven, evidence-based understanding in a year how many shootings are really quote-unquote gang-related or driven by their membership and participation in the business of a gang, and how much is really interpersonal violence? Because we need to know that before we can come up with solutions to address either one. I think Wes Scogan gave a talk many years ago at UIC when I was in the department as a PhD student, and he had an unpublished manuscript talking about this and gang-related stuff. And I asked him, does the CPD have a firm definition that everyone across the department uses? And he goes, they have a very strict, very rigorous definition. And now that you look at the Inspector General's report about how broken their internal systems are, and they don't know what data they're turning over and relevant to subpoenas, and my FOIA experience, I could go on about how crazy it is. I don't understand. Do they know? Do we know? Does science know the answer to that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's multiple layers to it. So there's this legal layer, right, of like, what is a gang? And some states and some municipalities have very strict definition about what a gang is, right? So you have to have these many criteria. It has to be verified. There's a part of the debates around the gang database in Chicago. Have to do with you never get off the gang database, and so on and so on and so on. So there are legal definitions, and one could answer that question about how many of these shootings are gang involved versus gang motivated, right? So gang motivated, we traditionally think of like, this is my turf, this is your turf, we're fighting over this turf. Whereas gang involved means it just might have a bunch of guys from crews that are involved. So, there are different ways to answer that question. I'm not going to give you a number because I don't have one.
Right.
But what from looking at the shootings themselves is almost all of them are somehow based on interpersonal arguments, right? Which is, it's a dispute over something, a property line, a romantic relationship, a price of drugs, you stepped on my shoes, your brother said this to my cousin. So they almost all involve arguments, right? Of some way, shape, or some ongoing dispute. Gangs add a layer on that, which I think is what's distinguishable about gang involved or group involved violence, is that all of a sudden, Tracy's beef is my beef, and it can cycle back on each other. And so I think what you see in Chicago is that crews and factions and gangs, what they do is they amplify these things and they sustain them. And I think that also requires different sorts of interventions in, say, a domestic situation, right? Or, a robbery, or, the most victims and perpetrators know each other in shootings and in homicides. Stranger homicide is actually not is very rare. And so, it's hard to say how many exactly involve a gang or a crew, but quite a bit. And more than that, it involves people's networks, which I think is something that we've looked at in our work. So whether or not you call it a gang, the people around you, it impacts, right? And in some of those instances, the people around you will be motivated to, retaliate or get your back or whatever. And I think that then becomes also a locus for trauma when you're thinking about what you can do about it. So trying to identify those things and figure out the best way to mitigate those, the impact of them.
All right. So through your research, especially in Chicago, so if they're not necessarily gang, I would say orchestrated, the violence is to support the gang. How inundated is Chicago actually with guns? Because if these are interpersonal beefs that end up in a shooting,
Right.
then part of that is driven by the fact that they actually have access to guns where they can do that shooting.
So that's a magic number I would love to know, right? What we know is the police recover, anywhere between 8 to 10,000 guns a year, like every year. So in a world where I know the denominator is 20,000, that means those guns are gone in 2-3 years, right? But it doesn't seem to be the case. And so the short answer is there are a lot of firearms in the city of Chicago, and we don't know how many. But there's enough that we keep pulling off, again, 7 to 10,000 a year every year. So the guns are available. I think part of what our research has looked at in Chicago is that, people that are involved in networks where violence happens, they're a handshake or maybe two at most away from a firearm. So, it's not as easy as I have a gun myself, but I know somebody who has one and I can get it pretty quickly. And so, that's not a healthy situation for any community.
It really seems that the more you describe this and the more it's about all these small conflicts that a lot of people would say are small conflicts that end up resulting in a shooting, the less and less I'm convinced that the criminal justice system can play a major contributing factor into reducing this. Like a lot of times, I'm not sure if you have, if shootings go off about such small things, what is there for policing the way we traditionally think of policing to intervene in that?
So I think we're at a moment where lots of people are asking that question. And I think we should have been asking that question for quite a long time, which is, what do we want the police to look like and do in these situations? I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say at a minimum, we want them to investigate after the fact and try to figure out who did it, which is something it turns out CPD doesn't, the clearance rates are ridiculously low. So the one thing I think most individuals think is a core task of policing, I think we're not doing well at, and it needs to get better. What we know from sort of different sorts of spaces in gun violence reduction is that focusing on very specific places and people and behaviors tends to work. Which is you can get short-term reductions, going back to where we started this conversation, among groups in particular, with interventions that are actually combined between the police and community efforts. So even when you have small, law enforcement interventions, they don't tend to have a big impact on long-term trends, in and of themselves. And also they can have the opposite effect, which is if you round up a bunch of gang leaders, you can create some drama on the street where the dynamics then have to go back and forth. I think what lots of community-based violence interventionists have known and have tried to do for a long time is they're often the folks that can be there and put themselves within these disputes and networks and conflicts in ways that law enforcement shouldn't, because it is their neighborhood sort of disputes. And there are limits to that, to be absolutely clear. There are even some things that say outreach workers or victim services can't or probably shouldn't do. But when you're talking about inserting yourselves in these disputes, it tends to be local frontline violence preventionists, outreach workers, trauma care, victim services, preachers, teachers, your neighbors. All those groups tend to be the ones that have the most direct access. What they don't have, and this is another thing that's been changing in Chicago over the last several years in particular, is they often don't have the resources or the sort of other means or training to help them in their efforts, right? So they might not have, for example, best practices in trauma response, right? They might not have access to a computer. They might not have access to some of the things that they need that you would support, say, other professions. And so I think violence preventionists tend to be, in any neighborhood, they tend to be as good as the best organization in that neighborhood. And so what we need to see is an elevation of that work, a support of that work, and also the evaluation of that work, right? If something's working, we should see more of that. And then if something's not working, we need to reevaluate its sort of role and function. And I think, again, Chicago has ebbed and flowed in the space, but when you compare that to sort of a criminal justice response, you can't compare them. They're just totally different sorts of investments and professionalization.
Okay, you brought up, and we've been talking about gangs, so I'm going to ask you this. I know I had a professor, John Hagedorn, at UIC that I studied with, and he talked a lot about just the breakup of the gangs, especially black gangs, into, you used the term earlier, crews. And I had a recent retired police officer criticize a response, to these big roving units. Now criticize that as like, no, you're trying to address gangs as if you're in the 90s.
Yes.
Right. And so from your experience, are Hagedorn's, he was on the street, so is Hagedorn, what he was talking about, that the black gangs are kind of divided up into these smaller crews now. And so like dealing with them like we used to as a big, large entity, that time has passed.
So that answer to that one is simple. Yes. And I'll come back to that. I wanted to go back to something earlier just about gang membership or affiliation. So one of the mistakes we make, and you'll see how this builds into the question that you ask, is we treat, gang membership like it's a zero-sum game, right? And it's not. It's fluid, it's dynamic, it's more like a dimmer switch than an on and off switch, right? So I might be, I might be down with this crew when I'm, younger, and then I get a job, so I kind of taper off, and then, I come back and, I get involved because of something, but it's not like an on or off switch. And so part of the problems with, say, tracking these things is we don't have a fluid way to do that. And it not just fluid about your affiliation with the crew, but also your neighborhood and what your friends are part of, and say your girl you're dating. So it's much more dynamic. And actually that's true of gangs, to pivot back to the question you just asked. I'm just going to use this number as an illustration, but there are somewhere around 900 crews in Chicago. And the mistake that we constantly make, and the mistake that makes me nervous at this particular moment, is we treat all gangs like they're, the gangster disciples from the 90s. Or we treat all gangs like the case that Lausch and the U.S. Attorney's Office just made. Like every single one of those 900 gangs is like this gang of 30 people we just arrested, doing really bad things. And the truth of the matter is those gangs are outliers, right? Those crews that are still organized like that, of the 900, if it's, a 10 or so, that's still a small number. But if we treat the other 890 like that, we're going to go backwards, and we could potentially make it worse again, right? Which is something that we've done in the history, of Chicago. But it is absolutely true that gangs today are more about as they've always been, their local friends. They're 10, 15, individuals from your block. That's the priority. I often hear, there's talk in the news today about Larry Hoover trying to be moved, and, Marvell Thomas just got his sentence reduced. Larry Hoover's been in jail since before I was born. The young guys on the street today, like, they know his name, they understand the mythology, but Larry Hoover doesn't impact what they do. It's their local friends, and it's amorphous, and even the relationship they have with the history of their own organizations is part of it is like a history. Like, okay, that's great, you guys did this in the 90s, but here's where I am today.
Yep.
And here's what's going on my block, and here's what my needs are. And so I think it is a mistake. I also think it's a mistake, even from an enforcement perspective, if what you're trying to do is make hierarchical conspiracy cases, which is sort of law enforcement's traditional playbook, it's not going to fit the mold, right? But the violence itself is different, right? The violence itself is localized. It's about these interpersonal disputes, and how you intervene in that is something very different than sort of these, say, drug wars of the 90s, which were very differently motivated and carried out sort of by different people. So we do need to really think about what sort of policy solutions fit having a variety of groups. And the one last thing I'll say here is a great book out by Forrest Stewart who was at U Chicago, but is now at Stanford, talking about even social media usage, right? Understanding that the way, say, crew affiliated people are using social media is kind of the same as every other teenager and young person. It's about attention, right? It's the attention economy. And understanding that, yes, while some of those lead to offline disputes, most do not. And what that can do is it can, again, law enforcement or schools can look at social media and think every time they see someone bragging online, means there's some hardcore, shooter is wrong, and it's dangerous, because it feeds back onto this narrative that young people of color are just doing this everywhere and it's rampant, when actually it's not.
Yeah, just a comment. Hagedorn would talk about, he knew a lot of the old vice lords. And when some of them got out, he would tell stories of them going on the corner, and those guys couldn't care less who
That's right.
those
That's
old
right.
guys
Yeah.
were. Like, dude, I don't know what you're talking about, but I need to make my nut today.
Right.
Okay, so let's turn to your op-ed real quick. You talk about something I don't think gets anywhere near the coverage it should in Chicago, this surge of gun violence, but it's not alone. Chicago's not alone. This is a common thing that has been found around the country. So can you talk a little bit about how rampant this surge is across the country and what context that puts Chicago in?
So I haven't looked at the numbers recently. I point folks to Jeff Asher, who's written for The Upshot, who generally updates these data quite frequently. I think there's a lot of mid to big size cities that are experiencing increases in shootings, right? Including New York, I believe Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans, probably. So I think Chicago's not unique. I think it's also, we're overlooking a very obvious thing here, which is historically, in this country, going back to Prohibition and even before, when we've seen these upticks. And by the way, what we don't know is if this is the beginning of a climb or it's just a really bad year. So 2016 was a really bad spike, but it didn't continue. It dropped again very quickly. And maybe it would have gone had we not responded the way that we did. So we're living in a historical moment. And I think that's very important. But these other historical moments, when we think about the 80s, when we think about the 60s, when we think about the 20s and 30s, they all happened at a time when people were estranged or cynical of the state. And that responses, especially to young men in particular, who are often engaging in these things, it jolted their sense of well-being, their sense of belief in sort of the systems. And we are at one of these moments, and, quadruply with, the pandemic, as well as, discussions around police violence and systemic racism. And so, part of what's happening is clearly more than just Chicago. I do continue to think and believe that the embeddedness of, gangs as institutions in the cities, as well as the availability of guns, does make Chicago quite unique in this context, right? And I think that's part of the reason we continue to have levels of violence much higher than some of our, like LA, for example. And I think it's one of the things we have to, going back to earlier part of our conversation, think about both long-term and short-term responses. Because until we start having other investments, we're going to have this conversation again the next time there's a spike in Chicago. And there will be a next time, right? Crime never goes up or down in a straight line. Yeah. And so I think when you're living in those moments, everyone, of course, panics. But I think let's hope that we can get some kind of changes in place this time so that we can head back in the right direction.
Yeah, to me, it seemed almost like it had to happen. You put the pandemic, you put that many people out of work, you put that much economic instability into the system. People are getting evicted or worried about getting evicted. I just think we had all the recipes for this, and I hope it doesn't last. Okay, you talk about contact tracing and gun violence. So how can we use contact tracing to impact gun violence, especially in Chicago?
Yep. So good question. It's also one I've thought a lot about, but I think what we keep finding over and over and over again, and not just in Chicago, we've done this in Boston, we've done this in New Orleans, we've done this in Newark, we've done this in Oakland, so we've replicated these studies in a bunch of different places. And even, right now we're analyzing some of the recent gun violence. What we keep finding over and over and over again is you don't just have a random victim, right? In fact, what you have is a victim surrounded by other victims, surrounded by other victims. And so what we've done in our analyses, and the reason that we talk about contact tracing specifically in that piece, is that if you do that, you can start to see a large share of the violence. You can identify victims, potential victims, and more than that, people that are living in a traumatic situation in networks where multiple of your associates and friends and family members have been shot. And so the key thing here, and one of the things that makes a difference between understanding, say, COVID and gun violence is, COVID is infectious at rates that is actually quite higher than gun violence, right? Gun violence is very specific and interpersonal. You don't catch it by sneezing on someone, right? And so in fact, it could be more tractable as long as you can identify who's at risk and get them, services or interventions, or even just get them to calm down for a minute and do that. And by the way, the power of networks in these situations can either, aid or abet a conflict, right? So again, a very typical situation is me and you and one of our friends are at a party. Someone says something to you, and whether or not that dispute turns violent could be as simple as me saying, like, Tracy, let's get out of here. Or me saying, Tracy, are you going to let him talk to you like that? That is all the difference sometimes between something turning violent or not. And so having professionals inserted in these networks, people who are good at dispute resolution or mediating conflicts, or even just getting people, literally, but also figuratively out of town to calm down, can have a huge impact. And even what we know from studies on, say, cognitive behavioral therapy, like changing and slowing down thinking is important when you're in those contexts. It doesn't always work, but it can be the difference between someone getting hurt or not. And the reason we put it in the context of contact tracing is everybody's thinking about it right now. And oftentimes when you think about violence, and having done this for almost a decade now with different groups, once you sit down and you have them start drawing their own, say, network of violence, it starts to show you a very specific picture. And what we're trying to do is figure out how to use that for intervention purposes.
Okay, who in your mind would be doing, who would be doing that intervention, and what skill sets do they need? So is this another wing of the police department, or is this a whole new series of community organizations and specifically trained intervention people? What does that look like?
So I think the good thing is we have a few models for this. And I would point to the Los Angeles GRID office, to, New York City has the Mayor's Office for Violence Prevention, and the city of Chicago is trying to stand up its Office for Violence Prevention. In other spaces, what this looks like, and where Chicago, I believe, is trying to go, or at least it has been trying to go, is to get trained professionals. By here, we mean, say, street outreach workers, victim services and trauma outreach workers, and caseworkers, essentially social workers. And there's two steps to this process. One is trying to, again, having a front line that can be involved in these localized disputes. And in a city like Chicago, that is so important, because what happens in neighborhood A might not be the same in neighborhood B. And the dynamics might be different. The literal languages might be different. The context of whether the folks are younger or older might be different. And so you have to have a base level of knowledge to respond to incidents of shooting, as well as the disputes that drive them. And it has to be localized. It also has to be coordinated. So to answer the part of your question is, it's not just one group. It can't be one group. While I have a lot of hope for, say, the developments we're seeing in street outreach work in Chicago, they're not the ones that can be doing some of the legal services help, right? They're also not the ones who might be best equipped to, say, deal with physical injuries. And so trying to figure out how to coordinate those responses. And we should also learn from both other cities like LA or New York, and including some of the things that have happened in the city of Oakland, by the way, is you have to figure out where different boundaries are, right? So at what point actually is a police intervention, say, necessary? And at what point do we need to sort of distinguish and separate these things? And at what point do they need to come together? One of the things they're doing through the mayor's office in New York, of course, is when there's a shooting incident. I'm forgetting the name of the organization, so I apologize. But there's a shooting incident, say, in the South Bronx. Okay, well, at the same time that police are dispatched, street outreach comes with a van, and they set up shop, and they're immediately providing trauma services to victims' families. You have outreach workers going into their networks, trying to figure out, what's going on and who do we need to talk to. And all of that happens in a coordinated fashion. One of the things this city desperately needs is for those sort of territories between service organizations, the criminal justice system, education system, they actually need to we got to do better at pulling people together. Because one thing I've learned, and I think most folks, in this space will agree, it's not just one program or one thing that's going to work in every case. It's Pollyannish to think that's true, right? There will be some things that require, a professional interventionist. There are some that are going to require a street outreach worker. There are some that are going to require an educator. And what you need to be able to do is get the right services to the right people and coordinate that in a way that you rarely see. And when you do see it, it seems quite promising.
Okay, so how in make a recommendation? I don't know how to do it. If you pay attention to the language from the police union, traditionally it's been the language forever. It seems like they could just play a tape and just record it and just keep pressing play. But how do you bridge the gap not only between the police and the community, so the communities have faith in the police, but between the police and these outreach workers? Because if you read the blogs and you read the comments on the blogs, I don't recommend anyone do that, by the way. I do that. That's more than anyone ever should. How do you get them to work together? Because we are in a part of this seems like just political also between those entities.
So yeah, I never read the comments. It's definitely true. The one thing I'll say I've seen on the ground in Chicago and elsewhere, and I believe this experience reflects a lot of community organizations that I've done work with, but not all of them, and actually a lot of cops that I've worked with, is, there's not one Chicago police department, there's 22 Chicago police departments. Mm-hmm. So often what happens is you'll have a forward-thinking commander, right? Or a couple of really good sergeants who are willing to collaborate and work and understand boundaries, with certain organizations. And there are some, and conversely, there are some organizations that will do the same thing. No, we never, ever, ever will call the police. We'll never, ever, do this. And I think what you see when people feel most, again, just my experience, especially recently, is when you have specific opportunities to do that. And I think that doing that really, it's a lot of work. And police, from the policing side, they're not rewarded or promoted for that type of work, right? And that is part of the culture that continues to need to change, which is, cops get rewarded for making arrests, dope and guns on the table. It's not like this being the best, neighborhood policing officer or having the best reputation among local merchants or local nonprofits, advances your career. And that's a perverse incentive system. On the other side of things, especially say where violence preventionists are concerned, it's a long history that they're dealing with as well in terms of bad interactions with the police. And again, this changes every time there's a new commander. They have to start over again. Lots of organizations feel like we had a really good relationship with Commander Papachristos, but now, Tracy's in and we got to do it. And he doesn't like this group, he likes that group. And so, it's a lot of hard work. There's no easy way. And I also think it goes back to sort of the embedded nature of conflicts in this city. But part of it is trying to figure out which lanes belong to whom and when. So going back to the example you gave, who should be the individuals involved, say, in reaching into these networks, right? It shouldn't be police. In nearly every instance, it probably should be somebody other than the police. And if that understanding were developed and shared and agreed upon, between, say, police and organization B, I think you could see trust increase between organizations. I will say, and for one of the things police could do to really help repair trust with communities, and that's a big task, is start figuring out better ways to work with, say, outreach organizations or nonprofits that are not just, having a pizza party or barbecue, but are actually sort of a meaningful, deep, engaged way, listening. And, one way to lead is sometimes by listening. and sharing the stage and sharing resources. And that is also one of the things that's going back to this other element is, almost all these not-for-profits are unresourced. A lot of these organizations are meeting in church basements and backyards and kitchen tables. And, I think that, that's hard if you're always trying to keep the lights on to divert resources to work. And so there has to be new ways of thinking about funding and supporting those sorts of efforts as well.
Well, yeah, we always have money for more cops and more justice system and more people to incarcerate, but we never seem to have the money to fund any of that, which is just kind of blows my mind. So in your op-ed, you name Community Partnering for Peace as an example of heroes in Chicago. Can you tell us what they do and why you think they're heroes?
Yeah, so Communities Partnering for Peace, and there are other organizations doing similar work right now. Chicago Cred, the Ready Alliance or the Ready Chicago at Heartland Alliance. I think what's really key here is CP4P is not one organization. It's actually a collaboration of organizations from about 17 or so different neighborhoods in the city. They're all performing street outreach efforts. So these are, credible messengers for individuals who have been impacted by gun violence, who have gone on, they receive training. I forget how many hours, but they go through Metropolitan Peace Academy, which is run by MFS, Metropolitan Family Services. So they're getting some skills. And at a bare minimum, all these organizations are trying to, mediate conflicts, host public events called Light in the Night, where they occupy spaces, and by and large get people away from gun violence and towards other things. And all these organizations differ into how they do that. Some have a public health approach, some might be a religious approach, one is Kingian nonviolence. But what they do is they unify and coordinate the way they're approaching some of these base levels of problems. And the reason I say they're neighborhood heroes, which I think is the phrase I probably used, is they're out there every day. They don't make a lot of money. They're severely underfunded, and all hours of the night. Right? They don't have a union protecting their rights. Some of them have to work second jobs to make ends meet. When COVID happened, they not switched, but on top of, inserting themselves in escalating violence. We're giving out PPEs, trying to dispel myths about how you got COVID. We're making sure people were understanding what social distancing meant. And then the same thing as all the unrest has happened, after George Floyd's murder, they're trying to also deal with pain and trauma in neighborhoods that have experienced along the, legacy of police abuse. And I don't know what their salaries are, but they're not getting paid enough. And these are also individuals who are themselves have lived through, some have been incarcerated, some have been shot, they've lost loved ones. So as they're trying to heal their own neighborhoods, they're also actually dealing with their own lives. And so, I think as we try to understand these programs, which is what we're trying to do, understanding just the relationship with, say, a crime rate is one thing, but understanding their reach and impact is a fundamentally other. When everybody else was on lockdown, they were making sure people had food. Like to pivot and see them starting to give away boxes. New Life Ministries, in Little Village is giving out boxes and boxes of food every day. And then they go out and start to mediate disputes among gang members in the evening. I think that needs to be recognized, plain and simple, right? As not just a scientist, but as a citizen. Like that's one of the things that makes me proud to be a Chicagoan, right? That type of effort is what we want people to do in response to these crises, right? Who's stepping up? They are. Every year they step up. And I think what I like about these efforts we're seeing now, in addition to the fact that they just recently got money from the city and the Chicago Department of Public Health, and hopefully that will continue to bolster these efforts, is that they're coordinating them rather than competing with each other. They're coordinating their efforts, and they're trying to make sure that those things are getting into the neighborhoods, which is really key, I think, at this particular moment. And by the way, I should also say this includes victim services. So these same organizations, or at least some of the same organizations, but not all of them, are trying to make sure they respond to every single shooting victim that happens, right? Even if they're not, group involved or sort of something that can be, they make sure that they're reaching out to victims as they happen. And I think that's another thing that we should be doing, for the residents of Chicago, when we think about what we want to be, as a city, what we should be proud of. I think that's something we should be proud of.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I've had my issues with ceasefire. They're well documented on our website if people want to know what that. But one of the things that I've always said is that when people talk about whether this outreach works, first of all, I do think it has an impact. I'm not sure exactly how the greatest way to measure it is, but I just think flooding these communities, like if you flooded all those organizations with funding and resources, by the very fact that you're flooding them with money into those communities and jobs, you would see an impact, right? Which once again
Right.
brings us back to the beginning about how a lot of this, a lot of the underlying all of this is just poverty,
Yeah.
um, right? And I just think that it's all. I think that works amazing, but I also think it's something this city and cities across the country really have to um, get their claws into and get committed to it, despite the
Yeah.
fact that it may take time to see resources. It's a failure of the city that we have nonprofits doing scraping along trying to get food to people in communities, in my opinion, especially when we never seem to have enough cranes building things in the loop. So that's my criticism of city government and finances for the day. Professor, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us
Thank you
today.
for it. Thank you. It
I
was a
think
pleasure chatting.
your work's amazing, and hopefully we'll have you back on when you got your next paper released.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.